A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, magandang hapon, at magandang gabi. Welcome to your hour, and this is Rita Gadi. First of all, we have to greet everyone because this is a holiday actually that we're commemorating the first day of the new moon of the year of the tiger, as far as Chinese zoology is concerned, the year of the water tiger. Kung hei fat choi, as they would say. There are different kinds of spelling as far as that's concerned and many kinds of interpretations. And so we've chosen the shortest. Be happy, be healthy, and be blessed. And what is most important, of course, is we carry in the palm of our hands, in our minds, in our hearts, in our souls, the destiny that awaits us. Destiny, as they say, is a matter of choice. And as President Marcos would always say, do not argue with destiny, just be on top of it. Well, our program for this afternoon, after all the greetings that all of you are receiving and sending out, I have not been able to introduce myself, and it's been almost 100 or so of this Rita Gadi hour that's been going on for so many years now. And perhaps I took for granted that the name Rita Gadi is always associated with the fact that once upon a time, I covered the office of the president during the administration of President Ferdinand E. Marcos. But I have thought it over several times, and over the past days that we are on forced quarantine, senior citizens are of course not allowed to be roaming around as yet, although we are now on level 2, but nonetheless, we still have to observe the basic health protocols. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and keep distance if you're in a crowded place. So I'd like to get into my life and times, brief episodes which have some connection to the many things that I talk about. And there you would see why I seem to be coming out quite strongly about certain aspects and certain discussions, precisely because my life has interwoven with so many events that have actually come up with part of our contemporary history. So just so as background, I was born after the Second World War, and we lived in a place, in a house, I think it was just rented at the time, right across the street of the convent of the Carmelites. And this is the Clausura, or the Cloister of the Carmelite. And as a matter of fact, my grandfather at the time, I understand, was planning to settle around that area, but there were just so many other not buildings, but houses. So that was when he decided to look for a house somewhere, which is now known as, then at the time was probinsya. You know, it's outside of Manila, outside of Metro Manila even. Puro talahib pa yan, and that is Quezon City. And that was how, from that place in front of the Carmelite convent, my grandfather transferred to Sampaloc Avenue, because it was an avenue lined up with sampaloc trees on both sides of the road, but it is now called as Tomas Morato, after the mayor of Quezon City at the time, a good friend also of my grandfather. On my grandfather's side, he was Jose V. Bagtas, and he had 5 children. The eldest of his children was my mom. She was a doctor of medicine, and she was a radiologist. Next to her was my uncle, Tito Pete, as we called him, the junior, Jose Bagtas Jr., And he was also a doctor of medicine. He also married a doctor of medicine, Filomena Francisco, from Malolos, Bulacan. And then, of course, he was, after graduating from the University of the Philippines, he wanted to further his studies in medicine. And he was now in New York and training to be a neurosurgeon, as a matter of fact. That is what I still remember at the time. So he was in New York and training to be a neurosurgeon. After him was Tita Eva, or as the nun, Sister Jose. I must have talked about her already sometime, or I wrote about her in my Facebook post. She is a Belgian nun of St. Teresa's College. She was formerly Miss Luzon and then eventually went to New York, Fordham University, graduated with the honors from the university and also her master's in psychology and then her doctorate at the University of Santo Tomas. But while she was abroad, she wrote a poem to her father, that is my grandfather, Lolo Pepe, as we call him, because he was a Mason. And at the time, there was this kind of, a dichotomy between the Masons and the Christians, or the Catholics for that matter. And so she was afraid that her father, my grandfather, might not allow her to enter the convent. And so she wrote a poem entitled, I Am the Daddy of a Nun. Nonetheless, after she toured France, when she got back to the Philippines, she entered immediately the novitiate in Pacdal. I think many of you who would be familiar with the way the novitiates are cloistered in Pacdal before they they take their vows for the nunnery. Anyway, that is my aunt, Sister Jose. She was also my godmother at my baptism. And I wrote about her when I greeted Mrs. Corazon Aquino on her birthday, just to acknowledge the fact that I did not realize that she was a very good friend of the former President Corazon Aquino. As a matter of fact, it was during the wake of Tita Eva, or Sister Jose. I was there and we were waiting for the arrival of my other aunt. So anyway, that was where I met Mrs. Aquino. So nonetheless, we were surprised to see each other. And almost at about the same time, we asked how we were both related to Sister Jose. And so I said, she's the sister of my mom. And then she said that she's more than, Mrs. Aquino said that Sister Jose was more than a sister to her because she was the guide, the counselor, etc., and all of this. So they were very close. Anyway, that is the irony of fate. And as I've said, God really works in very strange ways, but absolutely with some exactitude. After Sister Jose was Tito George. Tito George was an engineer, and he married into the Ledesma family, and from the Don Julio navigation lines, and stayed with them for the rest of his life. That's Tito George. And the youngest is Tita Elsa. She married Tony Viterbo from Capiz, from Rojas City, while she was in school taking up law, and together with her husband, when they were both studying, their best friends, parang barkada, very close friends. You had Ines Soriano, Nestor de Villa, then of course Inday Magalona, and several others. Pitoy Moreno was also a very good friend, and that's the reason why on very special occasions, my baptismal dress, my first communion, etc., my debut gown or whatever, were all from Pitoy Moreno. He was part of the family in many ways. So that was because of the fact that the youngest sister of my mom were very close. On my father's side, his father, my dad's father died at a very early age, but there are 6 of them. So his mom, Lola Josefa Fernandez Gadi, actually was a single mother, and she took care of all her 6 children. The 2 eldest were both pharmacists. That's Tita Helen, married to a dentist, Tita Helen Gadi Medina. And then you had Tita Aida Gadi Alejandrino, married to my Tito Edil Alejandrino, the brother of Ambassador Alejandrino, and also Castro Alejandrino, and the philosopher of the Communist Party of the Philippines. They were all related. So the second daughter of my Lola Sepa on my father's side, Aida Gadi Alejandrino. And then there was Tito Tito Aning Juan, who was a junior. He's a lawyer. And after Tito Aning, you had Tito Ben, who perhaps those who are my age or even who would remember this. Tito Ben is an engineer. He graduated from Mapua and he was a playing coach. And I think at the time, that was the only time that Mapua Institute of Technology won the NCAA because of Tito Ben. He was a star player. As a matter of fact, students in Mapua, if you go through they have a hallway there of distinguished graduates, you would see there the acknowledgement they give to my Tito Ben Gadi, an engineer. And then the youngest, of course, Tito Rod. And he became the manager of the first airline in Cotabato City. So that's the family on the Gadi side. Nonetheless, as I've said, we had doctors on the Bagta side. My grandfather was himself a lawyer and at the same time a civil engineer. He established the National Power Corporation, which was actually the grandfather or the grandparent of what we have now, the Department of Energy, etc., and all of this, already forecasting that energy would be the most vital element and one of the most vital industries that we will be encountering in the future. So then they transferred to Tomas Morato, and this is where I've already written about this also, the house on the hill. At the time, Quezon City was adobe, and the house on the hill really was on top of an adobe mount hill, but it was a 3-story home with a large basement, and then you had the sala, the receiving room. It's an old structure at the time where you had all of this old kind of wood as the flooring, etc., and all of this. But it is in this home, the house on the hill, where I grew up in the sense of the traditional way, like a grandmother who was training me because I was the eldest granddaughter. All the different manner of eating, etc., and all of this, proper etiquette, so to speak. So that was the kind of environment we had. It's the old school. I'm sure that many of you who are hearing me would still remember that there was a time then where traditional practices were really quite, very conservative. Like for the longest time, I could not wear shorts. And the only pants that we could wear at the time, they called it the pedal pusher, which was a pair of pants which would reach only up to your knees. And possibly that's the reason why they called it pedal pusher, because it was used when you're biking. And just to show to you how conservative it was at the time, we could not go out without a chaperone or with a companion or a maid with us. You could not be, many things. We could go into that. But what is important as far as that house is concerned, that is why I say that certain episodes of my life weave into contemporary history. I grew up in that house until I got married and transferred to Cotabato. But prior to my getting out of that residence for the past 17, 18 years of my life, that was where I lived. And that was where, as I've said, we were taught traditional families, usually you have to know either to sing or to play a musical instrument. And so I had to go through piano lessons, both in school and also out of school. And we had a little kind of some kind of a theater, not really a theater, but we had some kind of a stage in that house where whenever there were occasions for celebrating a birthday or anniversaries, all those who could play a musical instrument would have to play a musical instrument. So I was either tasked to play or to orate, to recite some passages from Shakespeare or from whatever. So that was the way it was then. Iba na ngayon, hindi kagaya ngayon na basta pag may party kayo, kainan, sayawan, kantahan. At the time, it was really to show off. What talent does this child have? And usually talent was associated either to being an orator, or you could sing, or you could play a musical instrument, the violin, the cello, the guitar, a ukulele, or the piano. So that was how it was then. But as I've said, that house is historical because when there was the Nacionalista convention for the elections for the presidency, and Ferdinand Marcos, as Senate President, transferred to the Nacionalista Party from the Liberal Party. It was Mrs. Marcos who was really going from one delegate to the convention and the others. So she was courting them so that they would vote for Ferdinand Marcos in the national convention of the Nacionalista Party, because at that time there were several candidates, and Puyat, Tolentino, Pelaez, Lopez, and all of that. And all of a sudden, here was this Senate President Ferdinand Marcos transferring from the Liberal Party to the Nacionalista Party. So he was new in the Nacionalista Party, and they needed Mrs. Marcos, and Ferdinand Marcos at the time needed the votes of the delegates to the National Convention. And this was nationwide. Well, it so happened that my father was also in politics in Cotabato, and he was handling 10 delegates coming from Cotabato. You must remember at the time, this was 1965, Cotabato was still the largest, the biggest province in the Philippines. It was not yet divided the way it is now into 5 provinces. So Cotabato had 10 delegates, and my father was the provincial chairman, and he had 10 delegates under him. And Mrs. Marcos, or the Nacionalista Directorate, knew about this. And so she went to that house on the hill to talk to my father, because at that time, my father was in Manila precisely for the convention of the Nacionalista Party. But my father refused to meet with Mrs. Marcos because he was already committed to Hil Puyat, a candidate also in the convention. And the head of the Nacionalista Party was what they called the grand old man. This was Amang Rodriguez. And everybody knew that Cotabato, with the 10 delegates, was already pledged to Hil Puyat. So that was how it was. And my father, who was upstairs in the second floor of that house on the hill, did not want to come down because he did not want to meet with Mrs. Marcos, who was the wife of the Senate President Ferdinand Marcos. And she waited. She sat in the lanai, which is actually facing both the front door and the gate, which is about several meters down the hill. And then, of course, if anybody would be going out of the house, they would have to pass by the lanai. Anybody coming in from the street would have to pass also the lanai. So she knew. She sat there and she waited. And I had to entertain her. I had to talk to her, and that was where she told me all about the qualifications of Ferdinand Marcos, etc. And of course, at the time, I could not vote yet. I was how old? 17, 18 years old, and voting age at the time was 21. And so that is why I mentioned Tomas Morato, or Sampaloc Avenue, the house on the hill, because that was where I met Mrs. Imelda Romualdez Marcos, wife of the Senate President at the time, for the first time. And she waited, I think, for close to 3 hours. So my father, who was upstairs, decided, harapin na nga. So he went down. Believe me, in 10, 20, perhaps even not even 30 minutes after Mrs. Marcos talked to my father, she won him, in the sense that he was able to pledge to her the 10 delegates that he was handling for the convention in the Nacionalista Party. Can you beat that? That was how convincing Imelda Marcos was at the time. And as I said, that was also the first time my father met with her. So anyway, I am mentioning that because I lived in that house on the hill. And as I've said, portions of my life interweave with contemporary history. And that was the reason, likewise, why during the campaigns of 1965, in most of the cities and provinces that that Senate President Marcos at the time was campaigning, I was joining with my father. I was not yet a journalist in that sense of being a journalist, but I had the diary, and that was where, as I've said, I wrote down copies. I wrote down the days of the times whenever we would visit certain provinces, and I even had a map where I wrote the names of all the big wigs, so to speak, the leading political lords of the province. I wrote them all down so that I had a record of. Anyway, so that was the house on the hill. From Tomas Morato, or Sampaloc Avenue, as you would say, our neighbors are also familiar names. Mrs. Delgado was about 2 blocks away. That is the mother of the Delgado Clinic. And one of the Delgado daughters is married to, Ekahuangco. And then you had across the street from Mrs. Delgado, not across, and on the other side also on Tomas Morato or Sampaloc Avenue, you had Mrs. Dairit. And of course, you know, all the restaurateur and all the good food, etc. of Mrs. Dairit. And several others. I will, you know, some names I will have to mention, but these are more the prominent names at the time during this place. And of course, the Moratos, which were also on top of an adobe hill. And then you had my Tita Helen Murphy, who's the first cousin of the mother of Danding Cojuangco. Danding Cojuangco's mother is a Murphy from Baguio. And just adjacent to our house, after a small street, is Helen Murphy, married Agarde, and they migrated to the States. So these are the men and women who moved about in my life at the time, in Tomas Morato in Sampaloc Avenue. So then in school, for instance, there were also several events that could be considered as part of not just my growing up years, but many of the things that have conditioned me to be what I am in many ways. Santa Teresa, St. Teresa's College in San Marcelino. At the time, just so long as our educational system now has really evolved into a very different manner the way it was then. During my time, there was no age limit for you, or an age requirement rather, before you can enter school. There were no nursery schools or nursery schools. There was just immediately kindergarten. So at 3 years old, my mother, who was also the school physician of St. Teresa's College in San Marcelino, decided to enroll me already in kindergarten. Then you had the famous institution nun there, Sister Redempta. She must have, she must have been the Sister Redempta of so many generations, all the way even up to my son, who was also in her class. And this is where I learned from her when she met with the parents, when she said that you are bringing your children quite late. And so we were surprised because she said, well, at 5 years old, they have already received so much of so much of their education in your home. So I will try, she said, here in my class to be able to teach them further as far as good character and right conduct and the basics are concerned. That was Sister Redempta. And how true it was that sometimes we take for granted that the mind of a child is what we call a tabula rasa. You know, it is an empty blackboard where you can really imprint so many things which will stay there for the rest of our lives. That is how important the first 5-7 years of our lives are concerned. And that is why the training that we receive, or the kind of environment that we have, the eugenics and the euthenics in those first 7 years is so important. And St. Teresa's College Kindergarten, I think, was one of the best as far as the training ground of the children are concerned. And we are so proud, Teresians are so proud whenever we speak of this. But that is how education is. And that is why in Japan today, for instance, you have the first years actually without the basic arithmetic, reading, and all of this, but they are teaching them good character and right conduct, etc., how to behave, and of course, the Bushido code, as we would speak it, the code of the samurai in many ways, as far as the children are concerned. So that was St. Teresa's College, and we were traveling, imagine, from Tomas Morato all the way to San Marcelino, and I would fall asleep most of the time because I had motion sickness. So I would sleep and then just wake up as soon as we got there. And my grandfather, Lolo Pepe, when he fetches me in the afternoon, he would take me quite often to Botica Boye, which is in Escolta. Escolta was like the Makati at the time. And on the mezzanine, you had this soda counter and also the coffee shop. And he would meet his friends there. And he would have me sit at the soda counter. And that is where I learned to taste all this all this soda, strawberry soda, mint soda, etc., and all of that. That was after school when he would fetch me and all of this. So this is where he met also with several of his friends and several of his associates. And this is where he expanded many of his investments. And that is why my grandfather, other than the fact that He was Undersecretary of Public Works. That's why I told you he was the one who established the National Power Corporation. He also had he bought ranches in Cagayan, in Bagao, in Tuguegarao, and then of course he expanded this in several other areas because my grandmother from the Matriano clan was from Lopez, Quezon, and my grandfather also bought number of hectares of coconut in Lopez and in Tayabas. So that was how my family on the Bagtas side was concerned, on my mother's side, how they were involved in and what kind of a livelihood they had. And on my father's side, my grandmother, as I've told you, she was a widow. She was widowed at a very young age and had to raise 6 children, also all professionals. I've already mentioned them. But she was supplying rice coming from Nueva Ecija to Divisoria. So she would be traveling. That was her livelihood, and that was how she was able to take care of all her 6 children. They were Ateneo graduates, and then graduates of the University of Santo Tomas, and then Mapua for their respective disciplines. That was the way it was then, and it's so different now because, as I've said, character education and right conduct is now being introduced again. It got lost somewhere, but that was very basic as far as elementary and high school and secondary education was concerned. We also had a subject called home economics because women or ladies or girls are supposed to know the strictures and all the things that you have to do in raising a family and raising a home. Not just how to cook or to crochet or to sew, but how to budget for your daily meals, etc., and all of this. I don't know if we still have it now, but sometimes we forget that a woman's role also basically is motherhood. And this is where they introduce this in that subject called home economics. But going back to how it was then, my aunt, who was a nun, had this, she had this conviction that I would be also a Belgian nun. And so she wanted me, in many ways, I was involved in the Sodality of Mary, in the Student Catholic Action, in any of this. Like the Student Catholic Action, for instance, we had seminars, we had training outside of the colleges, and that was where I befriended. When we had a seminar in Baguio City, and my close friends then was Chimbi Calao, and the daughter of Senator Calao, and Tessie Oreta, Tessie Aquino at the time. So we were seated in front, we even have photographs together and so forth. But anyway, these are close friends, and both of them have gone ahead of me anyway. So that was how the training was. It was a Catholic kind of training, Christian in many ways, and we were not just confined to what we were learning in the college, because St. Teresa's at the time was run by Belgian nuns, and there were only very few Filipino nuns. As a matter of fact, if I would remember, we had only Sister Angelina, Sister Nieves, Sister Coronel, sister of Dean Coronel and auntie of the Coronel ladies now, and my aunt, Sister Jose. All the rest were Belgian nuns, Sister Ludwin, Sister Arnoldus, Sister Annunciata, and all of this. Well, to mention all of them anyway. But what I'm trying to drive at is the fact that we were run under that Belgian concept. Very strict, very traditional, and of course, very disciplined. And that is why after high school, when we were already choosing our careers, of course, I wanted to be a doctor. My parents were both doctors. My uncle and my aunt are doctors, 4 doctors in the family. I was following suit. And my father already transferred from Manila to Kidapawan in Cotabato. He was an adventurer. So he went to Cotabato, to Mindanao, to find out where he could settle. And the first town that he went to was Parang, because he thought it was a lovely place and so forth. But then when he saw Kidapawan, he fell in love with Kidapawan. That is how he settled. So he set up a clinic in Kidapawan, a little hospital, if you would call it, but it is called Rita Gadi. But he also entered into politics, became a mayor eventually, and so forth. But he was in Kidapawan at the time, and I would be traveling even at a very young age. I think I was only 8 years old. I would be traveling by myself from Manila to Davao. And at the time, yung mga aeroplano non, propeller pa. We did not have any jet planes yet. And our seats were made of canvas. and we would be stopping over in so many airports, Romblon, Masbate, kung saan-saan yan, before we got to Davao. And then from Davao going to Kidapawan, naku, ang sama-sama ng karsada. We had boulders and rocks that were perhaps in the eruption of Mount Apo pa at the time. The roads are very bad and very dusty. So it would take approximately 2.5 hours or 3 hours just to travel from Davao City going to Kidapawan. Anyway, so that was life then. And as I was saying, it was already because of the fact that my father was involved in politics in Cotabato. It, again, as I've said, was interweaving with the politics of the time. Cotabato was being run by the Liberal Party political leaders. You had Salipada Pendatun as as congressman, and then you had Dato Untug Matalam, who was the governor of the whole of Cotabato City. And my father kept on challenging them in a way that he would run against them for the position of either governor or congressman. And this was alternately as he was mayor, and then he would run, and then would go back as being mayor. And my mom also took over as mayor when my father was running again against this Muslim politicians, and he never won against them because like we have difficulties now with Smartmatic, the way they come out with their results, etc. But at the time, kasi manual ang voting, so we only had the certificates of canvass, which was on paper, and then you had the total number of votes at the end, and we did not have the cell phones or radio or whatever. So I'm sorry, we only had we did not have cell phones, mobile phones. So we only listened to the radio. And so that was how, yun ang dayaan. Pag madinig sa radyo na nananalo na yung kandidato na yon, buburahin na dito sa dulo yung election returns, dadagdagan, etc. Pag misa nabubutas na nga, etc. But that was how it was, and that was the political life then. But as I've said, the leading leaders then were the Matalams and the Pendatuns, but you had other Muslims who were also challenging them. And perhaps now you'd recognize these names. You had the Sinsuwats, and then you have the Ampatuan. This was the Ampatuan clan of Dato Sangkit, who was, I think, half Arab, half Maguindanao. I have met him several times, also with Dato Odin Sinsuwat and his wife, Bai Sinsuwat. I've met them many times during that time. And so I'm saying my life then was also interwoven in the contemporary politics of that particular time, my life and times. But as I've said, because of the National Convention and Marcos was pitting his bid against several candidates of the Nacionalista Party, there was the first voting and there was a tie. And then there was a second voting where he won. His votes was 777 votes. For whatever it may be worth, again, this is not a matter of coincidence, but by some strange arrangement, when there was a one-day lull for the next voting, because as I've said, the first voting, there was a tie between Pelaez and Marcos. It was Mrs. Marcos who asked me to join her to go and pray. And we went to Baclaran. And that was the first time I saw her, that she would walk on her knees all the way up to the altar. Naku, haba nun. You know, the aisle there was quite long. I couldn't follow her. I just followed her standing up. But you see how it was. She remembered me because, as I've said, I met her for the first time in that house on the hill in Sampaloc Avenue or Tomas Morato when she was courting the votes of Cotabato for that national convention. You see how strange things happened, and there are no coincidences as far as this is concerned. So Marcos made it to the presidency. And so how was my life then? Well, I was working with Shonil Jose from my third year college because some of my friends were already working in other newspapers. I tried it with the Manila Times, but I was kicked out from the Reporters Bureau precisely because I could not write, a direct report. And I was told by the editor then that I should not be describing a murder case or a criminal case like I'm writing a story, and just report who, where, when, how, etc. But that is just to show to you that I did not finish journalism. I was enrolled in the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters in the faculty in philosophy. I was majoring in philosophy. How did I get there? Well, after enrolling in UP for the College of Medicine, my aunt Sister Jose pulled me out of UP. At that time, UP had the reputation of being communist, etc., and all of this. I think many of you of my generation would know this, and maybe of your grandparents would know this, na ang UP nakakatakot yan kasi mga free thinking yan, etc. Well, the Sister Jose got me out of UP and brought me back to Santa Teresa and boarded me and made me an interna so that she could guard me. And she said, okay, you take up all your science subjects here. And so I was enrolled in the first semester with a lot of science subjects. And that was how most of my classmates were fourth year students. That was why Tati Liquanan, Patricia Liquanan, who became also with the Department of the CHED, Higher Education, and then eventually president of Merinol or Miriam College, became my classmate because I was attending classes in the fourth year so that I could get the science subjects, because that's exactly what the nuns were saying. They transferred my scholarship from UP to the scholarship that was called the Mother Bartholomew Scholarship, because she was the Mother Superior of St. Teresa's in Santa Teresa. So I was an intern for one semester. But my father was really raving mad and said, no, she's supposed to take up medicine. And so he wanted to bring me back to Santo Tomas. And so my aunt, Sister Jose, said, okay, but she will have to take the psychology test, etc. and all. Well, I really messed up that psychology test. And what came out as a result was I wanted to take up agriculture. And so they both knew, my father and my aunt, who's the nun, both knew that I was already messed up as far as my choices are concerned. And that was where Father Paniso, who was the dean of the college of the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters, was a very good friend. And so they decided to enroll me in that little college known as the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters. Maybe about a couple of thousand students only. In fact, we were occupying only several classrooms in the building known as the College of Education and the College of Commerce. So be that as it may, that was how I got into Santa Tomas, and then that was the second semester. So when I got there, what do I do in this big university? Oh my goodness. It was really quite a culture shock in many ways, coming from a convent school and then having at least a few episodes in UP and then being brought out again so that I could be in this big university. And it was there that I decided that maybe I should do something for myself. So there were oratorical contests. I wanted to join the oratorical contest in English, but that was already closed, because you must understand that during my high school days and college days, I was the delegate for the Voice of Democracy, for the school plays, Bida Bida Ka Don, the boy with the cart, and then several others like Tombs of the Living, which was in college already, where you had all of these big names in college also participating in that particular drama. So I thought that maybe I could join an oratorical contest in the University of Santo Tomas, but English was already closed, and the only opening was in Spanish. So I went to the dean and I said, can I join the Spanish contest? And he asked me if I knew how to speak Spanish. And I said, no. And he said, how do you expect to join this oratorical contest? And so I said, well, make me a speech, have me memorize it, then teach me how to orate it. And I'm going to give you an award. I'm going to get an award for our college. And so he was probably stunned at my audacity for this. And so he did. He wrote my speech. He had me coached by Miss Servania, who was the college Spanish professor. And he had me participate in the university oratorical contest for Spanish. And believe it or not, I won. I won in that oratorical contest. And when they were announcing the win, I was expecting at least to get third place. But when I did not get third place, my head was already bowed and I was already praying. And I said, thank you, Lord, at least for this chance to have participated. And I'm so sorry that this is as far as I can go. And then they were announcing the gold winner, or the one who won the highest award. And when they were saying my name, I thought it was just mentioning the fact that I was also a participant, until the other candidates beside me were saying, oh, Señorita Rita, etc. They were speaking Spanish, which of course I didn't understand, because the only thing I knew was my speech. And so that was when they said that I won. And I'm glad that my grandmother was there with me, because when the priests were congratulating me regarding my speech, and they were asking me questions about my speech. It was my grandmother who was able to answer all of this because I kept on saying, si, padre, si, padre. Because my speech began with Cotabato. So this is where I'm telling you that all of these things intertwine. Vengo de la provincia más grande de Filipinas. Vengo de Cotabato. Allá, entre los maizales y cocotales, mis padres se dedican vamos a curar, anyway, Muslims and Christians, etc. So it was about the story of my parents settling in Cotabato and treating Muslims and Christians in Cotabato, and that was my speech. So you see how intertwined some episodes of my life are with actually contemporary events. So anyway, that was college, and so after that, well, at that time, again, this is where we veer off. Nowadays, our young people are not in a hurry to get married. Our generation was that after you finish college, aba kailangan mag-asawa ka na, kung hindi old maid ka na. See, that was the perception at the time. Anyway, that was how it was. 19 years old and you were married off, whether it was successful or whether it was not, whatever else happened, that was already your destiny. So what happened was, from my firstborn, after he was delivered, I decided when he was 10 months old to join my parents in Cotabato. First, because my mother was developing a strange kind of illness at the time, which could not yet be determined because it was new. It was only eventually discovered that it was Parkinson's disease, part of the nerves, etc., and all of that. So my father and I thought best that I would transfer to Kidapawan in Cotabato to help out. My mother was the incumbent mayor at the time, but she was already showing the manifestations of the Parkinson's disease. And so that was how, together with my eldest son, who was only 10 months old, I transferred to Kidapawan. But her sickness was getting worse, and it was Dr. Bengson, a classmate of hers from the University of Santo Tomas, who was the one who was able to prescribe that her sickness was Parkinson's disease, and it had no cure. I think up to this day, it still has no cure. But there are certain medications that you could take to lighten or to lessen the tremors and the trembling. So that was how it was. And that was how I got into Kidapawan. And this is, again, the interweaving of politics into my life, because there in Kidapawan, because of the sickness of my mother and by strange arrangement of politics, I was appointed as acting mayor of Kidapawan, at least for 2 years or so. And then we had the Constitutional Convention elections in 1969, and that was when I also participated. And as I've said, precisely because it is difficult to win in areas where, as I've already mentioned, you could just come out with the results in a piece of paper, the canvas of votes in a piece of paper. So there were other candidates that I run with from the Muslim side, because then the daughter of Untug Matalam's husband became my good friend and also one of those that run with me. Plus the other tribes, as I've said, I mentioned already the big names, Ampatuan, Sinsuat, etc. But there were other kingdoms, other royal families, as Rajabuaya and Rajamuda, etc. And they also had sons who wanted to run for the Constitutional Convention, and I joined them. So we were a group. We had Sandiali Sambulawan from the Rajabuanan, then you had the Ampatuans also with us. Then you had Musibwat, who became one of those rebels leading the rebellion already in that part. And then you had several of them. So we were all together, and that was why when the elections came, there were protests against our group because many of them were associated to be with the independence movement. And that is why there were 10 delegates for Cotabato, and I was number 10, but was never proclaimed, precisely because there were protests. But as a matter of fact, for about a year or so, or a year and a half, they were sending me, a lot of material coming from the convention, the national convention, but I was never proclaimed. But that was how politics wove in and out of my life and these episodes. And that was when I met, although I knew him already as the provincial librarian, but he was assigned to me as my translator and part of my security by the Muslims who were joining me in that campaign. And this is Hashim Salamat. So you can imagine how the traveling that we undertook and the many nights and days that we were together and as a whole group, when I had the chance and the opportunity to talk to him and he to talk to me of how he is convinced that there ought to be an independence movement for Mindanao. He was the provincial librarian of Dato Tugmatalam, but what happened was he was sent to the theology university in Cairo, and that was where he got exposed to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And so because of that, when he came back, he decided that we could set up an independence movement for Mindanao based on what he learned as far as the Palestinians were concerned. So, but politics came in, and what in the beginning of the independence movement, President Marcos was able to talk to the political leaders, both from the Lanao provinces and from the Cotabato provinces and all of this. So you could see it did not flourish. But as far as the great mass and the majority of the Muslims are concerned, because of Hashim Salamat, or the peasantry, because he did not belong to any of these kingdoms and all of this datoship, etc., he was able to propagate the Mindanao independence movement. So you see how my association with him in the early stages of the independence movement actually protected Kidapawan from many of the not skirmishes, but many of the violent incidents with the military and our own armed forces and the rebel movements in Mindanao. Up to this day, for instance, many of those younger Muslims who were involved in that independence movement would remember the fact that Hashim Salamat and I were very close during the campaigns for the Constitutional Convention. You see how it weaves all the way. And then again, as I've said, when we went to Tripoli to have the discussions with Gaddafi so that he would stop supporting the independence movement, Hashim Salamat was there in one of the floors of that building together with another rebel, Nur Miswari, etc., who was also our contemporary at the University of the Philippines anyway. So that is how, as I've said, many episodes in my life interweave with contemporary history. And then after that, I went back to Shonil Jose after Cotabato, and then I was hoping to finish my Islamic studies, my master's, although my postgraduate already in anthropology was done, but I wanted more on Islamic studies. But while I was at the Philippine Center for Advanced Studies in UP, it was Mrs. Carmen Nakpil, Chitang Guerrero Nakpil, who told me to join her at the Philippine International Convention Center, where they were having this International Conference on the Survival of Humankind, which was actually the precursor of the Habitat of the United Nations. And she asked me if I could edit the scientific documents of the scientists who were participating in that conference. Imagine, these are about 20 pages of their delivery, and I had to reduce it into one page. Anyway, she got me there to the PICC. She gave me a room and she said, okay, we're going to pay you well so long as you could do this editing so that we can have this as our giveaways for the delegates, etc., and all of that. But because of that, they needed somebody who would be interviewing the scientists. And so it was Tita Chitang, as we call her, who asked me to do the interviews and brought me to the National Media Production Center in Intramuros. Wala pa sila dito sa Channel 4. Intramuros pa yan. So I didn't know anybody. She said that I am the one to be interviewing the scientists. And so that was it. And then the person assigned in Malacanang, Vero Perfecto, some of you would remember him, tall, handsome, and with a beautiful voice, died of a heart attack. And so after this convention of the International Convention on the Survival of Humankind was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, delegates coming from 150 countries. And that was why the PICC was built precisely to be able to house all of them and all of the requirements that they had. So that was how I think it was, they say, although I never knew this firsthand, they say that it was President Marcos who said that little girl who was interviewing the scientists, you get her assigned to the IMF World Bank coverage. So that's how I got into television, of which I have had no training, no background, and did not finish any course in broadcast journalism. So I had to do a lot of research and a lot of studies before covering the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Conference, which was held at the PICC. And after that, I had a contract that they presented to me. This was a contract for a talent, parang talent contract, for me to cover the office of the president. So not a government employee and not employed by as a government personnel in any of those entities of the NMPC, but as a talent at the time. So that was where I was assigned to cover the office of the president. And that was a contract for 3 months. Then they extended it for 6 months. And then they extended it for 1 year. But believe me, it was one of the most difficult times of my life because, you know, the industry of media is really, I think all of you who are in media would know this, talagang kainan yan. You know, and I did not know anybody. I was not part of any group. I was not endorsed by any organization or any radio program, etc. I just came from nowhere, from the Islamic studies, from the Philippine Center of Advanced Studies to Mrs. Nakpil, and then all of a sudden, there to cover the office of the president. So a lot of research and study that I had to do. Kaya nga sinasabi ko, kung pinag-uusapan ko yung opisina ni President Marcos, talagang pinag-aralan ko muna yan. And then after that, the first visit, the first diplomatic, not first diplomatic, but the first time that Mrs. Marcos is invited to the United Nations to address the United Nations, first time that the First Lady would be addressing the United Nations, I was assigned to coach her with her speech for the UN. So we did this for a whole night, but I think she got tired of my whatever. So what happened there was I told President Marcos that that speech of Mrs. Marcos is a speech for a man, not for a woman. And so they were surprised, but that I talked that way. And so I said, I can make it more fluid and easier to recite or easier to read as a woman would read it, but I will not change the content. And so Marcos is saying, but you know, Blas Ople, etc., all of his writers were the ones involved in writing it. This is the new human order, etc. So I said, I will just change the fluidity. And that was how, after that trip of Mrs. Marcos to New York in the United Nations, then I got assigned to cover Mrs. Marcos whenever she would be traveling abroad for diplomatic missions. As I've said, really a bonus in my life because then I've had the opportunity to interview 4 American presidents, you know, a lot of heads of state, all the way from Chou En-lai to Deng Xiaoping and all the way to Indira Gandhi. I will not mention all of them because I've talked about them so many times. So my life, as I am mentioning it, interweaves with all of this until 1986 arrived. I think I also talked about what happened in Malacanang in those 4 days of February, which would be shortly coming, which will be celebrated again, commemorated again in a couple of weeks. But then after 1986, then Mrs. Marcos calls me from a phone booth in Hicam, asking me to talk to her former blue ladies and asking them to send her dollars because they had to buy milk for the babies, etc., and all of this, of which I had no contact with them whatsoever because, you know, you're just a reporter in Malacanang. You don't associate with all of this blue lady. But whatever it is, as I've said, that is how life has been. My life and times. And then when when I already had the opportunity to visit them in Honolulu because I was on hold order list for quite a while, then that was the time when I was able to interview President Marcos up really close. We were seated in the dinner table. The first time I sat with them for meals, for dinner, for lunch and dinner. So I was able to interview him. How is it? How are you? And then, you know, do you regret having done anything, etc., and all of this. And that is why I always say it is first-hand information that I'm relaying when I make this broadcast of your hour. And then what happened was when President Marcos died, Mrs. Marcos felt that she was going to face the lawyers by herself because she had they were all indicted in New York for that RICO case, etc. But prior to that, as I've already mentioned before, I was already going all of these documents in the office of the law office here, so that I knew exactly, not exactly, but I knew some of the background. I had some background as far as those evidences are concerned, or whatever else that they're going to present. So Mrs. Marcos asks me to join her in Honolulu and then all the way into New York for the trial of the Marcoses in the courthouse of John F. Keenan. And that was how I've said, I've seen them, I've heard them, I've read them, and that is how, because of first-hand information, I am able to talk about it. So that is the life I've had, weaving in and out of many of our contemporary historical episodes, not only because of the opportunity that all of these heads of state that I was able to interview also had some bearing on many of the things that are happening in our country, like, for instance, the Tripoli Agreement. And then we had the entrance of our overseas workers to the Middle East. These were professionals at the time. You had doctors, nurses, engineers, educators, teachers, and all of that. It was only much, much later that we had domestic workers and so forth. But in the beginning, because of the opening of all of those diplomatic relations with the Middle East, with Iraq, with Libya, and all the other countries, we were able to bring in the professionals from our country to these places anyway. So that was how, as I've said, in many aspects of my life, interviews with foreign ministers and so forth, and the association I've had with many of the members of President Marcos' cabinet. Some of them I've interviewed in many ways, including, as I've said, many of those programs that I have handled by myself, and these were produced by Rod Reyes for Channel 4 and the National Media Production Center. This has brought about more of the knowledge that I have as far as the administration of President Ferdinand Marcos is concerned, and of course of Madame Imelda Romualdez Marcos, all her projects and so forth. Although I also had a close association and a working, a very good working relationship with her press officer, the late Ileana Maramag. And then she was the one who supplied me with a lot of information insofar as the projects of Mrs. Marcos is concerned. So that has been my life and times, since I have not really gone through other details as far as other aspects of history is concerned, but I've talked about them already in many ways over the past 2.5 years, 100 or so Rita Gadi hours that many of you may already have known. And the reason why I'm talking about this now is perhaps I have never been able to introduce myself properly in that manner. I have no business whatsoever, private or otherwise, all throughout those years of the administration of President Marcos. I am not a businesswoman. Swelduhan lang po. And that is why whatever it is that I received from the contract I had with the National Production Center was not enough to raise 4 children who were studying in colleges in La Salle and in Assumption. So I had to seek other jobs elsewhere. So I had other contracts with, the Development Academy of the Philippines, the Development Bank of the Philippines, the University of Life, the Metro Manila Commission. Lahat yan aswelduhan, and that was how I was able to get by. After the term of President Marcos, wala po akong natayong negosyo sapagkat wala naman talagang pondo. Whatever I earned was enough for the children and of course for anong tawag doon, basic needs, house, shelter, food on the table. So that has been my life, and up to this day, we live in such a manner. There is no big business at all, small or big, that you could say that I am handling or that I have, or any big property that I am availing of, etc. Because that was my past. My grandparents on both sides were the ones who had that big element of support for their children and their grandchildren, and we live by that. So as I've said, that is the way life is. You really do not have, when you're there in the corridors of power, that is where you can really see how people would grasp and would really attempt anything to be able to satisfy themselves, either because of their ambitions to be in a political post or because of greed in many ways. I've seen it all. I've seen many of those who got appointed, many of those who were chosen, many of those who left because they were not given the kind of position they wanted. They've turned against their benefactors. Many of those who availed of the best that both President Marcos and Mrs. Marcos could offer, and no sooner would turn around and condemn them and be part of the opposition against them. I've seen it all. I know them by name. I've seen how they behaved. Perhaps someday I don't know if they're even worth writing about. But in my diary, it is purely the coverage I have undertaken with the many events that I have handled as far as Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos are concerned. And as insofar as the political events of the time, that too was part of our coverage because we had it on live television. You've seen me in many ways as far as that's concerned. So that's how it goes. Well, thank you for listening for this whole hour. There are other episodes perhaps that will be coming up in the future. But for now, it is important that we go back to what we are presently facing. In less than 100 days, we will be electing people that will be occupying the highest seat in the land. Perhaps sometime I will be able to discuss this more in detail. Not just qualifications, but I've always gone back to this. A person who has in his heart, in his or her heart, the vision and the intention to really serve our people. And so we close our program. As always, dear God, walk with us through this season of whatever this pandemic is bringing us, whether it is increasing or whether it is decreasing, open our hearts to your guidance, O Lord, and give us the strength to share your love with others through this time of uncertainty. May we look at each day as a celebration of your greatness, O Lord, and please make us ready to receive your merciful healing and love. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you for having joined me. This is Rita Gadi, and this has been your hour.